My first encounter with a Buddhist monk. In the first week of August 1965, after finishing summer school, I set out to travel by car from New York to California. I was 20 years old, and in September, I would be entering my senior year at Brooklyn College. I wanted to visit a friend who was spending the summer in San Francisco, and I managed to find a ride with a couple of fellow students. We started from a luncheon near Brooklyn College on a bright Monday morning, and after a full day of road, we stopped in Madison, Wisconsin, to spend the night at the home of some friends of the people with whom I was traveling. This was the first time I had ever traveled west of the Pocono Mountains, and the experience promised to be an exciting one. After a good night's rest, the next morning I decided to take a walk. It was a bright sunny day. My steps led me through quiet streets to a large, beautiful lake bordering the University of Wisconsin. Turning inland, I soon found myself on the campus. As I was approaching a mall in the middle of the campus, something astonishing happened. To the right of my field of vision, the door of a big stone building suddenly swung open, and out stepped a middle-aged man with East Asian features wearing a yellow-orange robe. He was immediately followed by a tall American man, who then caught up with him, and the two walked side by side talking. At once I realized that I was looking at a Buddhist monk. I had never seen a Buddhist monk before, and in America at that time, the number of real Buddhist monks could probably be counted on one hand. I had just begun to read about Buddhists a few months earlier, and I knew from my reading of Hermann Hesse, Siddhartha, that Buddhist monks wore saffron robes. Thus, I could identify the person I was seeing as Bhikkhu. I was struck with wonder and amazement at the sight of this serene, self-composed man who radiated a lightness, inner contentment, and dignity I had never seen before in any Westerner. The American man alongside him, presumably a professor, seemed to show a certain respect and deference, which suggested to me that he was not an ordinary monk, but a person of some stature. Just watching him walk across the mall, I was filled with joy and happiness. I think my feeling might have been similar to what a young Brahmin in ancient Indian might have felt if he looked up and for the very first time saw, walking down a path close by, a monastic disciple of ascetic Gautama, the man that people call the awakened one. I must have been about 70 yards from the path along which the two men walked. I wanted to approach the monk and ask him who he was and what he was doing, and so many other questions. But I was so shy, afraid that I would appear foolish. So I just stood there watching him, devouring him with my eyes, observing his every movement during the first 4 or 5 minutes it took for them to walk across the mall. I was transfixed. I felt transported to another dimension of being. Something in my heart stirred with a deep yearning. I think that if someone had come up behind me and stuck me with a pin, I would have felt nothing. So absorbed was I in the figure of this monk. Then he and the professor reached another building. The professor opened the door, and the two men vanished inside. I still felt joy at this, chance encounter with a Buddhist monk, but my joy was now dimmed by a note of sadness, for my heart sank at the thought that this adventure was over, and I had lost the opportunity to tap a living source of the wisdom of the East. Now I thought that wonderful monk will go his way, and I must go my way, and our paths will never cross again. The working of karma is indeed strange and unfathomable. A little more than a year later, in September 1966, I entered Claremont Graduate School in California, 25 miles east of Los Angeles, to begin my doctoral program in philosophy. In the spring semester, a Buddhist monk from Vietnam came to study in the same university and moved in just below me in the graduate residence hall. He was not serene and self-composed like the monk in Wisconsin, but a happy-go-lucky who played the banjo, sang Vietnamese folk songs, smoked French cigarettes, cooked gourmet pork and chicken dishes. Though by his Himalayan monastic vows, he was supposed to be a vegetarian and study political science, a subject about which he could speak with boldness that could have drawn blush from Henry Kissinger. For all these reasons, despite my interest in Buddhism, I initially kept a distance from him. Still, once I got to know him, I came to like him and eventually accepted him as my first Buddhist teacher. By the time the summer 1967 came, we were sharing the same apartment in the graduate residence hall and later moved to a small house off campus. One day, I think it was in November 1967, he told me that a distinguished Buddhist monk from Vietnam named Venerable Thích Minh Châu was in the U.S. and would be soon visiting Los Angeles. Venerable Minh Châu, he said, was a rector of Vạn Hạnh University, an accomplished Buddhist scholar. He had gotten a doctorate degree from Nalanda Buddhist Institute in India and had written an important comparative study of the Pali Majjhima Nikaya and the Chinese Madhyama Agama. My monk friend was planning to go to Los Angeles to meet Thích Minh Châu, and he invited me to accompany him. So one bright morning in the late autumn, we arrived at the house of the Vietnamese family with whom the distinguished monk was staying. When Venerable Thích Minh Châu came out from his guest room, I saw a middle-aged man draped in yellow-orange robe, serene and self-composed, dignified in manner, radiating goodness and sagacity. He looked indeed very much like the monk that I had seen 2 years before crossing the campus of the University of Wisconsin. Still, I couldn't be sure that it was not unlikely that the two middle-aged East Asian monks could be alike. I had seen the monk at Wisconsin from a distance of 70 or 80 yards, and thus could distinguish his facial features very well, so I decided to inquire. I had to wait patiently while my monk friend, Venerable Thích Minh Châu, and the host family spoke in Vietnamese. When I got an opportunity to ask him, "Is this your first time visiting America, sir?" He said, "No, I was here a few years ago." That was what I expected. Then I asked, "By any chance, could the Venerable have been on the campus of the University of Wisconsin in early August 1965? And he said, "In fact, I was. I was visiting my friend, Professor Richard Robinson, who started a program of Buddhist studies there." Then I told him about that day when I had watched him walk across the campus. He chuckled gently and said, "So this is not the first time we are meeting." Several years later, when Venerable Thích Minh Châu next visited the U.S., perhaps it was 1969, he stayed with us for a couple of days at our house in Claremont. Still later, when I was planning my trip to Asia to receive Bhikkhu ordination and study the Dharma, he gave me useful advice and provided me with a beautiful open letter of introduction to Buddhist authorities in Asia. I kept that letter and still have it with my belongings in Canada. It was he who suggested that when I go to Sri Lanka, I study with Venerable Nyaya Mahathera. Though I could not fulfill that aim for several years after my arrival in the island. During my first years as a monk in Sri Lanka, I occasionally wrote to Venerable Thich Chau for advice, and he always answered me promptly and thoughtfully. I lost contact with him after South Vietnam fell to the communists in 1975. But when planning this lecture, I recall our earlier meetings, and these memories became so vivid that I felt I had to make inquiries about him. Through the internet, I contacted a Vietnamese webmaster in Australia and found out he is still alive in Ho Chi Minh City, though weak and ill with Parkinson's disease. He must be close to 90 years of age. I have written a letter to him and sent it by email to the Australian Vietnamese webmaster, who has forwarded to a friend of his, a monk in Vietnam, who is a former student of Venerable Minh Châu. Over the past few decades, before his illness incapacitated him, Venerable Thich Chau translated into Vietnamese the four Nikayas of the Pali Canon. In fact, I learned only very recently. Now here is the remarkable and uncanny thing that raises some interesting questions. On that day in early 1965, a 20-year-old American college student who would one day be the co-translator of the Majjhima Nikaya, translator of Samyutta Nikaya, and let us hope someday the translator of the Anguttara Nikaya, encountered by sheer chance a Vietnamese monk almost 30 years older than himself, who would translate the four Nikayas into Vietnamese. The American student at that time was not at all involved in Buddhist studies and had just started to read about Buddhism. He had no intention of meeting the monk, and in fact, they did not meet face to face. Looked at from the standpoint of objective causality, the encounter was sheer coincidence. The American merely made a chance turn while taking a walk in a town he had arrived by chance, saw the monk from the distance, and then went away without even knowing who he was. The monk did not see the American at all. But what made me decide to take a walk that morning and to turn off the lakeside road onto the campus at just that point and at just that moment? Was it really entirely a matter of chance, a mere series of random decisions? And if we can raise this question, then let's ask, what broader loop of conditionality might have connected my trip to California with the monk's trip to Wisconsin? At just that time, if I remember correctly, we were due to leave Brooklyn 2 days earlier, but at the last minute, he forces us to postpone our departure until that Monday morning. If I had left as originally planned, my meeting with the monk would probably have not taken place. When I left the campus, convinced we would never meet again, I did nothing to consciously facilitate another meeting with him. Yet, I made a whole series of decisions without any conscious design that brought us into contact once again, and this time in a situation where we would be facing each other as fellow Dharma followers. I selected a graduate school that eventually brought me into contact with another Buddhist monk with whom I became friends, yet I selected it without even knowing that this monk would attend that school. In fact, without knowing anything about Vietnamese Buddhist monk, and through my friendships with him, I came to meet the monk whom I had seen 2 years earlier, whose deportment had so impressed me, yet without knowing that these two monks were acquainted. Though I know that Thích Minh Giao had written a scholarly comparison of Pali and Chinese text. Years later, when I took up the work of translating Pali text, I did not know that he was engaged in translating Pali Nikayas into Vietnamese. Yet our projects in our respective mother languages are almost identical. Yet, this would also somewhere foreshadow in that chance encounter at the University of Wisconsin, a place to which I have never returned since that meeting, and to which I shall probably never return in the courses of